In June of 1496, Christopher Columbus returned to Spain after his second expedition to the Americas. And although it had been a complete dumpster fire, he was still apparently suffering under grandiose delusions that things were going well. In reality, he had found hardly any of the gold he promised, did very little to accomplish the goal of converting the native people to Christianity, and instead had tortured, abused, murdered, and enslaved them. But no matter, he had already set his sights on a third voyage. This time, he'd shore up his colony, La Isabela, in modern-day Dominican Republic on the island of Hispaniola with fresh colonists and supplies, and he'd do some more exploring, heading southwest in search of a larger landmass he mistakenly still believed to be Asia. Columbus was likely excited by the prospect, a fresh start, a triumphant return to a land that he governed, their righteous leader come back. But did you know this third voyage would be nothing like Columbus' grandiose daydreams, and in reality, he'd soon find himself in chains aboard his own ship? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. This is part 2 of a 2-part episode on Christopher Columbus, so if you missed last week's episode 80, you really need to go back and listen to that one first. When we left off, Columbus had basically lit a match and thrown it over his shoulder towards a gasoline-soaked colony, sailing off into the sunrise, back to Spain, already daydreaming about his next great adventure. He had left his 2 brothers in charge, Diego and Bartholomew, as well as a man named Francisco Roldan. When he got back to Spain, he began making plans to send more Spanish colonists to La Isabela. He requested 330 people, specifically 100 men to work as woodmen, soldiers, and laborers, 50 farmers, 40 squires, 30 sailors, 30 cabin boys, 20 goldsmiths, 10 gardeners, 20 handymen, and 30 women. God help those women. Plans were made to send friars and clergymen, a physician, a pharmacist, an herbalist, and even musicians for entertaining the colonists. Most of these people were volunteers, but some were prisoners that had been pardoned in exchange for working in the colony, and others had been sentenced to exile, and so they just switched the exile location from wherever else to Hispaniola. The other purpose of this third voyage was to explore more in search of a large landmass that was rumored to be to the southwest. This is South America, but they don't know that yet. So in May of 1498, 3 ships set out heading back to La Isabela, the colony left behind on Hispaniola with all of the new colonists on board. And another 3 ships with Columbus on board sets out to do the exploring. And then they're going to meet up with the colonists on the first 3 ships at La Isabela later. Columbus heads farther south this time, and they first spot the island of Trinidad about 2 months after leaving Spain. Then they make their way to modern-day Venezuela, which is in South America. Columbus notes, just based on the topography, the land itself, that it must be the mainland. And although he refers to it as a, quote, otro mundo, or other world, dude still thinks it's part of Asia. So they bop around for a while, landing in new places, Trinidad and Tobago, Venezuela, Grenada, but he's determined to make it back to Hispaniola, to his colony of La Isabela, before the supplies on his ships spoil. And he's not in great health at this point. He's suffering from insomnia, arthritis, and ophthalmia, which is like an inflammation of the eyes. He's probably hoping to return to Hispaniola, retake his seat as governor, and just chill and recover for a bit. But that is not what happens at all. When he gets there, he learns that Francisco Roldan, the guy that he had left in charge along with his 2 brothers, had started a rebellion. He holds the territory of Zaragua, along with quite a few colonists that have joined his rebellion. Many of these were from the group of new colonists that Columbus had just sent over. Like, they just got there, and they were like, the Columbus brothers suck. We're going with this guy. And that's mostly because they were still expecting to find all this gold and riches when they arrived. And when they got there, there was none. They felt that they had been misled by Columbus, and so they joined the rebellion. Now, those ships, they go back to Spain, and they carry with them returning colonists and sailors who go straight to the Spanish court and complain, accusing Columbus and his brothers of gross mismanagement of the colony. They tell them about all of the abuse, the harsh punishments, plus the fact that Columbus was making no attempt whatsoever to convert the native people to Christianity. He wasn't baptizing anyone like he said he was going to do. And there's a reason for this, guys. Once they are baptized, they cannot be enslaved. They are really and truly Spanish at that point. So if he doesn't convert them, if he doesn't baptize them, he can justify enslaving them. And so these people returning to Spain, they're telling the monarchs all of this. Now, meanwhile, Columbus gets back and he learns of this rebellion, and he's just mentally and physically exhausted. He needs help. He needs backup. So he sends 2 ships back to Spain, asking them to appoint a royal commissioner to help him govern, to help him fix this mess, this rebellion. But he doesn't realize the returning colonists and sailors, they've already completely obliterated him with what they have shared with the Spanish court, all these accusations of mismanagement, to put it lightly. And so Spain does send a guy, Francisco de Bobadilla, but he's not necessarily there to help Columbus. He is actually given complete control as governor of the Americas and is tasked with delivering the news that Columbus must relinquish all control of the colonies and can keep only his personal wealth. When Bobadilla arrives, Columbus' brother Diego is actively executing rebels, and Columbus is off trying to suppress a revolt in Granada. He's like, okay, this is truly a dumpster fire. He gets there, the colonists basically rush to him and are like, oh, thank God, the Columbus brothers are nuts. They're executing everyone. You have to fix this. Bobadilla recorded that, quote, 7 Spanish men had been hanged that week, with another 5 awaiting execution, end quote. And this is actually really interesting. That came from a 48-page report that Bobadilla wrote based on the testimonies of 23 people who had witnessed the atrocities committed by Columbus and his brothers. And that report was actually lost for centuries until 2005, when it was rediscovered in Spanish archives, shedding a whole new light on the real character of our hero, Christopher Columbus. And here are some of the things that Bobadilla recorded in that report based on his inquiry. Apparently, Columbus had forced priests not to baptize native people without his permission so that he could first decide if they should be sold into slavery. Because remember, once they are baptized, they cannot be enslaved. He had captured a group of 300 indigenous people under Roldan's protection and sold them into slavery. He ordered 12 Spaniards to be whipped and tied by the neck and feet for trading gold for food without permission. He ordered a woman to be whipped naked on the back of a donkey for lying that she was pregnant. He had a woman's tongue cut out because she had insulted him and his brothers. He slit a Spanish man's throat because he was gay. He hanged colonists for stealing bread. He ordered that a cabin boy's hand be cut off and displayed publicly for using a trap to catch fish. He ordered that another man have his nose and ears cut off and be whipped, shackled, and banished. Who knows what he even did? It's not in the report. Others were reportedly beaten to death with 100 fatal lashes, sometimes while naked. And icing on the cake, some 50 men starved to death because of tight control over rations, even though there was plenty of food. So, I mean, they've been doing this mess to indigenous people for years, and now these reports, a lot of this they're doing to Spanish people, to colonists, and that's where they draw the line, I guess. In October of 1500, Columbus and his brothers are locked in chains aboard Columbus' own ship called La Gorda. I assume that was the ship's nickname. Bobadilla took possession of most of Columbus' gold and treasure. His son, Ferdinand Columbus, recorded that Bobadilla had, quote, taken testimony from their open enemies, the rebels, and even showing open favor, and had auctioned off his father's possessions for, quote, 1/3 of their value, end quote. Which, wah, cry me a river, Ferdinand. Columbus remained in chains throughout the entire voyage back to Spain. Once there, he was jailed for 6 weeks, during which time he wrote this letter to a friend at the Spanish court. Quote, "It is now 17 years since I came to serve these princes with the enterprise of the Indies. They made me pass 8 of them in discussion, and at the end rejected it as a thing of jest. Nevertheless, I persisted therein. Over there, I have placed under their sovereignty more land than there is in Africa and Europe, and more than 1,700 islands. In 7 years, I, by the divine will, made that conquest. At a time when I was entitled to expect rewards and retirement, I was incontinently arrested and sent home loaded with chains. The accusation was brought out of malice on the basis of charges made by civilians who had revolted and wished to take possession on the land. I beg your graces, with the zeal of faithful Christians in whom their highnesses have confidence, to read all of my papers and to consider how I, who came from so far to serve these princes, now at the end of my days have been despoiled of my honor and my property without cause, wherein is neither justice nor mercy." End quote. After 6 weeks, Ferdinand and Isabella finally got around to releasing the Columbus brothers from jail and summoning them to the Alhambra Palace in Granada to give testimony before the court. Columbus reportedly wore short sleeves to show off the chain marks on his arms. Once there, he broke down in tears, admitted his faults, and begged them for forgiveness. And you guys, it freaking worked. That's the sick part about all this. He was never restored as governor, but he did retain the titles of admiral and viceroy. Bobadilla was also required to return all of Columbus' possessions that he had confiscated, and they even decided to fund a 4th voyage. I cannot conceive of why. The goal this time is to find the Strait of Malacca to cut through to the Indian Ocean. The Strait of Malacca is in Indonesia. So once again, Columbus is mistakenly believing that the Americas are actually Asia, and that he is one strait away from breaking through to the Indian Ocean. Never mind 2 continents and the entire Pacific Ocean that actually lay between him and the actual Strait of Malacca. But that's the goal of this 4th and, thank God, final voyage. In March of 1502, he sets out with 142 men and strict orders from the king and queen to absolutely not, under any circumstances, stop in Hispaniola. Of note, he brings his son Ferdinand with him on this voyage, who is only 13 years old. They cross the Atlantic pretty quickly in only 20 days and land in Martinique. But Columbus gets the feeling that a hurricane is brewing. He's like, I really think a hurricane is coming. I just feel it. Or maybe he's using barometric pressure or something. I don't know. One of his ships also needs some repairs. So he goes to Hispaniola, even though he has been absolutely forbidden from ever going there. He cannot take orders. So he goes to Hispaniola, and he's denied entry, of course. Bobadilla, who is still in charge there, he refuses to listen to him when he warns him about this storm that's coming. Columbus can't access the colony, but his ships seek shelter at the mouth of a nearby river to try to ride out this storm. Now, meanwhile, Bobadilla has been ordered to return all of Columbus' confiscated possessions to Spain. So he goes about doing that, loading it all into a ship called the Agulla, which was the most fragile, not seaworthy ship. And he starts taking it back to Spain along with some 30 other ships. And they do, in fact, encounter this hurricane that Columbus had warned of, these warnings that he had ignored. They hit this storm, and it's an absolute disaster. Of the 30 ships, 20-some of them sink, including the ship that Bobadilla is on, and around 500 people drown, including Bobadilla himself. 3 of the ships make it back to Hispaniola, and only one single ship makes it through the storm and onward to Spain. Any guesses which one that is? The Agulla, the crappiest, least seaworthy ship that they put Columbus' gold and possessions on. This is so wild that some of Columbus' enemies actually accuse him of conjuring this storm as revenge, which of course we know isn't actually possible, but it is really crazy the way that it all played out. He's like, hey guys, there's a hurricane coming, and they're like, screw you, go away. And then they all drown, and only the ship with his stuff on it makes it to Spain. Wild. After this, Columbus and his men head to the mainland, making landfall in modern-day Honduras. There he encounters indigenous people who were most likely Maya, although we're not totally sure about that, and they introduce him to cacao, which is where chocolate comes from. Columbus spent months exploring Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama looking for this passage, this strait that would connect to the Indian Ocean. He learns from the indigenous people about a province, 10 days' journey by land west or 200 miles west called Seguare. There was to be found, quote, gold without limit, people who wear coral on their heads, who know of pepper, who do business in fairs and markets, and who were accustomed to warfare. End quote. There was also said to be water surrounding it. And I don't know what this is referring to. It sounds like the Aztec, like Tenochtitlan, surrounded by water, but I don't know. Columbus never goes to this place. He never encountered the Aztec, but it does give him his first clue that this is a totally separate continent and not at all part of Asia. Because this is the mainland, right? This is supposed to be China. There should be Chinese people here, but these aren't Chinese. They're totally different people. And so he starts to realize this is somewhere else entirely. And these tales of gold without limit will go on to spur continued Spanish exploration and conquest in Central and South America in later years. But Columbus doesn't go any farther. He and his crew are battered by storms and end up stranded in Jamaica for a year, their ships too badly damaged by the storms to continue on. One of the men he brought with him, named Diego Mendez, paddles a canoe with some of the indigenous people to Hispaniola to get help. I mean, I doubt he's paddling. I'm sure the indigenous Jamaicans are paddling. This voyage takes about 4 days of nonstop paddling, but they reach Hispaniola in a canoe, and Mendez goes to the guy in charge there now, Nicolas de Ovando y Caceres. Because remember, Bobadilla drowned in the hurricane that he ignored the warnings for. So he goes to the new governor like, hey, I'm with Christopher Columbus and we're stranded in Jamaica. Will you please come rescue us? And the guy's like, heck no. He absolutely hated Columbus and he did everything in his power to prevent them from being rescued, which is why they ended up stranded there for a solid year. That's how long it took for Diego Mendez to finally get someone to go help them. But even then, due to strong winds, it took the ship 45 days to reach Jamaica from Hispaniola. Now remember, this voyage had only taken 4 days in a canoe. But this ship takes 45 days to get to them. But, despite all this, 110 members of the original 142-member crew are still alive. And some of them decide to stay in Hispaniola, but most of them, including Columbus and his son, sail back to Spain in September of 1504. Columbus died 2 years later in 1506 at the age of 54. According to Dr. Frank Arnett at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, quote, after Jamaica, the patient's condition declined rapidly. Although a prolonged period of rest brought modest relief, by his 54th year, his arthritis was so severe that most of the time he was confined to bed. In cold weather, his agony was unbearable. Toward the end, his hands were so painful he could no longer write. Finally, on May 20th, 1506, shortly before his 55th birthday, already quite paralyzed, bedridden with gout, the patient died, end quote. His cause of death is listed as reactive arthritis precipitated by recurrent infection, with an alternate diagnosis of parrot fever, which is apparently some sort of bird flu. So who even knows? It seems like he was bedridden toward the end, and there's a lot of potentially fatal complications that go along with that, particularly in a pre-antibiotics world. But anyway, 1506, the man is dead, but the ripples are still just getting started. Columbus' first voyage and the exaggerated reports of riches and gold he brought back with him to Europe that were translated into all these languages set off a frenzy of exploration across the whole continent. Everybody wants in. It begins a chain reaction of exploration, colonization, oppression, and conquest that leads to the formation of the Western Hemisphere as we know it today, but not without major consequences. Not without major systemic issues that still affect us to this day. With the arrival of Columbus as the catalyst that sets off this reaction, we see the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. We see the decimation of native populations, mostly due to diseases introduced by European explorers. And when the indigenous people begin to die, we see the Europeans turning to Africa to continue the slave trade. We see the destruction of advanced civilizations, the Aztecs and the Inca, at the hands of the Spanish. We see the continued oppression of indigenous people for centuries as they were forced down into the lowest rungs of society, and the enslaved Africans and their descendants right along with them. Bogado says in that article for Grist, quote, "Haiti remains the poorest country in all of the Americas. The European Union region remains one of the wealthiest in the world. This isn't because of some innate curse on Haiti. It's because its peoples, their labor, their lands, and their resources have long been embezzled without reparation. The insidious nature of the colonization of the Americas, which started in Haiti, not only terrorized the people who lived there at the time, it also created a system that kept indigenous peoples in slavery or perpetual poverty, while Europe basked in wealth," end quote. But this chain reaction Columbus started, it didn't just have social consequences. It had environmental consequences as well. He arrived in an honest-to-God paradise on earth. And the people he brought with him, the people that followed after him, had absolutely no respect for nature, no respect for the land, for Mother Earth, like the indigenous people already living there did. It just wasn't part of their culture. The European nations that took over cleared the land for tobacco and sugar plantations, leading to a slippery slope of deforestation and soil erosion. What's more, the money that those plantations brought in, pouring into the pockets of already wealthy Europeans, helped fund the Industrial Revolution, when our carbon footprint absolutely exploded with unprecedented levels of fossil fuel burning that has contributed to pollution and climate change. Columbus' first voyage to the Americas is often cited as the beginning of the modern era. That's how monumental it was. It issued in the modern world, the good and the bad. And for a very long time, we just focused on the good. We chose to view Christopher Columbus as a hero, as a brave, daring explorer who courageously discovered new lands, our lands, the lands we call home. He's the forefather of our forefathers, a man deserving of a holiday, Columbus Day, the second Monday in October. When in reality, those weren't our lands, and we had no right to take them. What Columbus really did was steal and lie and murder and abuse. This is documented. And I don't care how brave you are or how much a certain group profited off of your misdeeds, it doesn't make them right. Christopher Columbus is no hero. He's a villain, like Darth Vader or Lord Voldemort, except he won. And because of that, We've been viewing him from the wrong side all these years. We can't change what happened. We can't go back and rewrite the story so that the good guys win and the villain is stopped. But we can shift the lens through which we view Christopher Columbus. We don't have to stay on the side of the villain. We shift this lens by learning the truth about what he did and sharing it with others. We shift it by letting the realization sink in, feeling the outrage, the betrayal, exposing the trickery. We've been tricked. We've been tricked all this time into thinking that Christopher Columbus was anything more than a vile, evil villain. And so to you, my friends, I say, Happy Indigenous Peoples Day, because that man will never get an ounce of honor or respect from me. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting, and maybe you even learned something new. Be sure to follow my Instagram at HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. And I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from NPR, Grist, History.com, BBC, Wikipedia, and the University of Maryland. As always, links to these sources can be found in the show notes.